Well, for those of you playing along at home, this is the Writ Race, Day 3. We're into the third full day of the federal election campaign here in Canada. I'm Dave Trafford, along with John Wright from Maru Opinion. And John, it's interesting, you and I can sort of sit here and split the hairs and parse all the language and everything else that's going on day by day, and look at the media and look at the communications and all the things that we nerd out on. But we're still in August. People are still in vacation mode. I heard somebody today say, haven't had a summer vacation in 2 years. Leave me alone. So the degree to which you expect to see a shift, because I know you're in the field now doing some polling, do you expect to see a shift in intensity, if at all, around engagement on what's going on this campaign?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that the public is not engaged yet. I mean, this is just a lot of noise in the background. People, of course, in the latter part of the month are probably spending time outside and doing other things, and that's why we have a campaign that's going to last until September the 20th. And oftentimes, Dave, you and I have watched in the past where people, or the vast majority of people, wait for the debates to take place, but it's the last weekend before the vote that they kind of zero in on what it's going to be. And we talked about that in the very first podcast that we did, where, you got these party leaders who walk into a bar and they walk up to get a drink and they look around the room and suddenly somebody catches their eye and you don't know whether it's trouble or it's going to be help. So I think we're still at that early stage. The second thing is, and I'm not sure the polling matters that much, even on the ballot or on the vote question in the early days, except, it gives us a sense of what the public thinks should be the most important issues or where things might be headed, but we're not in the full, battle of the campaign for another week at least. But you know what? The opening days of a campaign are interesting because it sets the tone, and it sets for all of us watching the political parties. Do they have their act together in connecting on a day-to-day basis on what the issues and how it, visually and viscerally, how are they dealing with things? So when I step back from the earliest days of this campaign, I think the Conservatives have actually hit their mark almost every day. You made note of it yesterday, the war room pivots on some things that could have been difficult. Mm-hmm. But it's also, even today, we've got Aaron O'Toole talking about ethics. A very smart background, very clear, decisive move that basically says if there's a criminal charge taking place, and he's obviously referring to SNC-Lavalin, then you can't lobby on that. And we're going to, make sure that the ethics are very clean on that. I mean, that's a very straightforward packaged piece that goes with his economic statement the day before. And, it's likely to follow. Every day is going to be a very clean message. Jagmeet Singh, yesterday talking about manufacturing, PPE. He's out in British Columbia where he really needs that to get some more traction, to pick up some votes. But today talking about pocketbook issues, talking about housing, the achievability for people, and then saying that he would put a 20% tax on housing for people who are going to be offshore buyers. I mean, both of them tie into a very clean theme. We're not seeing that from the Prime Minister for two reasons. Number one, it seems that he's always got an external event that's cutting the knees out from under him on a single day. Mm-hmm. So if it's Afghanistan one day, it might be the Nova Scotia election on the next day, and who knows what it's going to be the next day. But secondly, the performance is rooted in a very diffuse call to arms. There's no compelling thing in the middle of his going to the polls. It says, we need you to do this. And so the other two and the public are kind of driving what that ballot question is. To your point, I would like to see whether or not the Liberals by the end of this weekend change tact and suddenly focus on something. Because leading into the next week is where we start to lead into the run-up to the debates. And the Liberals, I think, by then are going to see their polling, and we're going to start to see public polling that sees whether or not which parties are having traction and who's going to have to focus or change direction at that stage. if the Liberals are slipping, and we have seen a bit in some of the early polls, the slippage to the NDP, then that's going to tell us that they should tack against the NDP in the next week and get a little more focused. So I think the weekend is in the beginning of next week is when we're going to see any new changes to where we're headed. And I think we're going to have to wait until then.
For the average observer, just, the folks who kind of trying to comprehend what this is all about, we talk about a 36-day campaign, by the way. And really, just as you mentioned, we're heading for the debates, and that will be a clear benchmark for all the parties. They lose campaigning time there, right? Because you know as well as I do, the leaders will be locked down for 3, maybe 4 days doing all the rehearsals. They aren't going to be out in front of media or the public. So now we're down to a 32-day campaign and a fairly short bit of runway from that debate until Election Day. So let me ask you this. You've made the point that the ballot question is vague, and that will probably be highly specific based on what we're seeing from the Liberals and the Tories, the NDP right now defining their own path and what they think the ballot question should be. Remarkably, they're fairly close. I mean, they're talking about pocketbook issues. They're talking about recovery issues post-pandemic. We don't hear the Prime Minister necessarily banging that drum as loudly. At what point is there a point of no return, do you think, for the Liberals to actually plant a flag and say, damn it, this is why you need to vote for us? And it can't be because it can't be Aaron O'Toole, or it can't be because of how great we were in the last 18 months of the pandemic. If they're going to have some clarity around that. Is there a window of diminishing return?
Well, there's going to be a point where the media and others are going to focus on who's winning and who's losing, and that's going to come right after the debate. So there'll be the English debate and there will be the French debate. And the funny thing is that in all the polling that I've done, oftentimes the night of the debate, when you get a group of people, and sometimes thousands we've been able to poll watching the debate, they think that somebody's won, but the next day the media in fact say, oh, it was somebody else. And that drives the perception, because who's watching the debate? I mean, what you'll get the next day and in the 24-hour newscast are going to be those clips that we all know, that everybody looks for. And so the public, that I think by then will start to tune in. So to your point, the Liberals and the Conservatives, the NDP, not so much the Green, I think, are going to have to come out of that debate having defined clearly what the critical element is to what they're trying to say, because a lot of people are not watching and a lot of people are not engaged. But the thematic around it's going to be really important. Mm-hmm. So if they say Trudeau won the debate last night, well, then people are going to suddenly go, okay, now I know who I'm looking at. If that doesn't happen, it's a very quick run to the end of the campaign. I'm not sure how you turn it around. So again, I think they're going to have to adjust earlier than they normally would in a longer campaign, which means that's why I'm projecting next week. If they're not picking up the traction that they think they should be having, or if they're seeing that either the NDP or the Conservatives are starting to mow their lawn on either side, then they're going to have to make some battleship changes immediately and change the channel and turn up the volume. So I think we're kind of in the phony war at the moment. Mm-hmm. There's still important days, clearly. But I think next week we're going to start to see some changes if there's the need to do so.
So Friday is our usual day when we record and post On the Ledge, which is the Ontario Politics podcast. And one of our co-hosts, Keith Leslie, is stationed in Nova Scotia. And Keith's spending a lot of time in his career at Queen's Park as the bureau chief for Canadian Press, etc. It's always great to have Keith's insight on this stuff as far as the provinces are concerned, because he's got a long, sort of a historic memory of the journalistic coverage right across the country. So I really do want to get him involved in this conversation vis-a-vis what happened in Nova Scotia yesterday. But I saw our friend Nick Nanos talking about this last night in some of the coverage. And, he was saying that the lesson here, at least, is that if the Prime Minister thinks he can run on his pandemic record, maybe not so much, because listen, you and I and Keith were the ones waving the flag for Atlantic Canada, saying if anybody did it well, they did it right in Atlantic Canada, particularly in Nova Scotia, where they managed to create the bubble. They kept their cases down. They made sure that when I went to visit, I had to quarantine for 2 weeks. And, all of those measures that we looked at them and said, yes, that's the way to do it. And they were all very proud of that in Atlantic Canada. Still, they bounced the Liberals who did all that and voted in a progressive conservative government. And I make the point of using that particular label. It is the progressive Conservatives in Nova Scotia, not the Conservative Party. So, maybe even that minor thing where the Prime Minister right out of the gate is saying, this has been pretty good in the last 18 months. What do you think? That's been the posture.
It's not one of the top issues that Canadians are interested in. I can tell you that. We have polling out tomorrow, and we can talk more deliberately about it. But people look at what the Prime Minister and other leaders across this country have done as, you did your job. Mm-hmm. I mean, thank you very much. It's not kind of like you should not be getting kudos for it, but it speaks to an issue of the volatility. Because interestingly enough, of course, is that the Liberals count on those maritime seats. You know that. I mean, you've been there among them. I mean, that's to get a switch like that, yes, is very dependent upon the personality and the premier who had been appointed by, or elected by the party in Nova Scotia, the Liberal premier, was kind of his first time out, and there were some hiccups even at the outset of the campaign. But you made a point of saying the progressive Conservative Party, and they moved into and in some ways outflanked the Liberals there. So that says to me that what you've done in the past doesn't really count for much. Number two is, if you're going to play with a playbook that's the 219 playbook instead of the 221 playbook, it may not be enough. And so I think, again, if you go back to all the times we've talked on the ledge, and we agreed, there's a bit of a mood out there, isn't there? Mm-hmm. It's a post-pandemic mood. It takes me back. When I talk about Ontario politics nowadays and I look at it and project to the federal government, it's 1990 for me. It's that time when David Peterson, the Premier of Ontario, the Liberal Premier, was at 50% in the polls in July. And no one did a poll up until the last 10 days of the election because everybody thought he was just going to walk in. But he'd done a couple of subtle things. He'd given away 2 Senate seats to try and negotiate the Constitution. There were a few other things. But there was a bit of a mood out there. And it just smacked him up the side of the head, where people sent a message as opposed to a mandate. I feel that mood. And I think that that's what's happened to a degree in Nova Scotia. The question is whether or not it's going to filter out across to the weekend, that when in the final weekend, when those party leaders walk into the bar and they look around the room and they catch somebody's eye, it's either going to be, hey, will you have a drink with me, or let's step outside. So I'm not sure where the mood is right now, but I would think it's out there somewhere.
2 things I want to get your take on. I see where, Aaron O'Toole was talking about how every member of his team that's going to run all the candidates have to be vaccinated or test daily. And to some degree, it clarified or at least reinforces his commitment to vaccines. I think it's bad reporting to say the Conservatives and the Conservative leader don't support vaccines. That's just not true. He's double vaccinated, and he has always said, let's follow it. Did he stumble day one out of it in terms of mandatory vaccinations for federal workers? For sure. But he, in making this announcement, he talked about the Trudeau 4th wave of the pandemic. And, earlier we were talking about the Prime Minister's use of cute words like she-cession and she-covery. I wonder whether or not that kind of rhetoric, that needling to say it's somehow Justin Trudeau's fault that we've got a 4th wave of the pandemic, where the political capital is in that. I don't get that.
No, I don't either. And I do think he was wise to phrase it the way he did. I mean, Aaron O'Toole, because it actually, if you look at what the unions put out shortly afterwards, he mirrors what they've said. I mean, you can't impose vaccinations, but you can make available the testing. And I know that that's the case in a lot of other places. I mean, it's not in our, in the private sector workforce. That's a different thing, where people are basically saying, if you're going to be in an airline and serving people food, you're going to be vaccinated, you're out the door. That can't happen in a in a lot of federally regulated sectors where you've got big unions and things like that. So, I mean, he's played it there. But the question in my mind has always been from the outset, is this really a wedge issue? Is it a point of differentiation? Do people really care? And I'm not sure they do. I think what Doug Ford has done in Ontario, which has essentially done the same thing that Aaron O'Toole has done, and that is, well, Aaron O'Toole hasn't done it as forcefully, but it basically said the candidates, you're going to have to out yourselves. You're either fully vaccinated in Ontario or you're out you could be out the door. But he's made some conditions, and I think it's acceptable to most people. So, again, I go back to this and say this is a bit of a side issue. I don't think it's a defining issue. Is it the same way the Prime Minister made took a shot at the Conservatives today when asked about crime in the Lower Mainland of Vancouver? He pointed to the page in the Conservatives' policy book that talked about gun control. And he essentially said, this is the crowd that wants to give assault weapons back to people, whereas we've given the power to the municipalities to take away handguns. But that's not really the issue on both sides. It really is about illegal guns coming across the border, and neither are proposing a solution to that. So I still think that when we hear about the early days of this campaign, we're still in a bit of a phony war. We've yet to have the next stage done, which is where people get down to work from sparring to punching. And I think that's where we're going to be leading into at the beginning of next week. So I think Aaron O'Toole has probably done better than most thought. The Prime Minister has probably not done as well as most thought. And Jagmeet Singh is, doing well. Mm-hmm. That's how I come away so far.
Yeah, and it, you talk about those the gun control issue, for example, or to me, I call those the red herring issues, because every year they trot them out, and every year it's the same rhetoric, and every year it's the same kind of siloed debate, and nobody gives a rat's rectum about them. I mean, there were guns in my house when I grew up as a kid. My dad he made sure that we knew what to do around them: gun safety, gun storage, all permits, all of this stuff. For the most part, for most people, the issue of gun control is a red herring. It's one of those shiny things over here. When we're in trouble, we'll start talking about gun control, so it just gets it off the track. So it's interesting to me that was kind of one of the first salvos that we're seeing the Prime Minister launch at the Tories. I mean, really?
So let me try and put this to scoop myself a little bit. The number one issue in the poll driving people's ballots at the moment is the cost of living and affordability.
That's shocking.
Followed then by the environment, followed then by jobs in the economy, followed then by the deficit. Those are from a long list of things we told people to pick two, and it's a long list, but there it is. So on the pronouncement of those issues, where do you think childcare as a low-cost element sits in that list with 2% support, way down the bottom? So what it says to me is that while it may be an important issue for many women, you have to make the connection between the affordability, which is the top issue, to daycare, which is down below. In other words, we're doing this to make it affordable so that you can save money and it can contribute to your own ability to have a cost of living that's easier. But there's not that clear connection, right? On the other hand, if Jagmeet Singh bangs a drum and says, we're all about making sure that you can have the amount of money to spend, and we're going to tax the rich people to give it to you, that is a bang on right against that top issue. Mm-hmm. So I think, to your point, the Liberals they're not in those top issues except for the environment. All of the other ones from the poll that we're going to release show the Liberal planks way down, like from the middle down, like 9%, 8%, 5% on their pieces, whereas the other parties have them in the top, where you've got 25%, 19% banging on their issues. That's where I think the problem is, because the Liberals are coming out with things that, much to your point, are kind of in the rearview mirror.
Yeah.
I mean, daycare's being done. Like they're they're doing it, but it's not tied to what the central issue is that's driving people. So I think, again, we may have to see a change up in their approach in the next couple of days. But will it be more pronouncement of that kind of an issue, or is it going to be attack? Like, is it going to ramp up and attack the other parties? It probably will be that more than.
Well, let me just, before we close then. So on that, I would hazard to say that to some degree, you might see daycare down low because they've already heard the provinces generally say, okay, we kind of buy into this. We're willing to do something with the federal government. And then on the other hand, you know, they've already costed out, or they're in the process of costing out the Conservative plan, where it's tax credits, et cetera, versus subsidies and the Liberals. But it's still about a $30 billion nut. So they're pretty close to it. So I get the impression that people are thinking, okay, whoever's there, it's fine. This is baked in. We'll have something that we'll be able to deal with, and daycare will be taken care of. So I'm not going to check that box as a major priority because it looks as though it's kind of in the motions of being managed.
Here's the issue that I see. Again, I'll go back to Jagmeet Singh. He was addressing today very directly the affordability of housing, the affordability of people owning their homes. That was the central message. When the Prime Minister was asked about the Bank of Canada and inflation and keeping things in check, he actually said, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, I don't pay really any attention to monetary policy. What I pay attention to are households. But he didn't frame it as affordability. He didn't frame it necessarily as a cost of living and make direct comparisons to that. I think it's a bit of a bank shot. It's not a head-on shot. And I think that, again, I want to wait for another couple of days to see whether this is going to have an impact. But what I do know from the poll that we're bringing out with tomorrow, it's not hitting the mark directly. It's a bank shot. And I don't think that we have time for a whole bunch of bank shots during a short campaign.
Yeah, calculating the English on that cue ball is probably not what you want to be doing at this stage.
Nope, drop it in the corner pocket, buddy.
You bet. All right, John, good of you to be here. We'll touch base with you on those numbers tomorrow. John Wright, I'm Dave Trafford, and this is the Writ Race Day 3. It's an Eye Contact podcast.